Hey everyone, and welcome to Medieval Nocturnes. Tonight, we're stepping away from castles and knights to explore a question often lost in the smoke of battle and the thunder of artillery. What did the soldiers of World War II actually eat? We'll journey from the scientifically designed K-Rations of the American GI to the ersatz coffee of the German Wehrmacht. From the hearty cabbage soups of the Soviet Red Army to the simple rice balls of the Imperial Japanese soldier. If you enjoy these deep dives into the quieter, more unusual corners of history, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps immensely. Now, find a comfortable spot, let the world outside fade away, and let's begin our story. Before the first bomb fell, before the first tank column rolled across a border, every military leader on the planet faced a colossal, unglamorous, and absolutely critical challenge: how to feed millions of men scattered across the globe. When we picture World War II, our minds fill with images of epic battles, acts of incredible bravery, and grainy newsreel footage of victory parades. We seldom pause to consider the fundamental, gritty realities, like whether a soldier storming the beaches of Normandy had a decent breakfast. The spoiler is, he almost certainly did not, and it was a logistical nightmare just to get him that far. Feeding an army on the move wasn't just a matter of cooking. It was a science of preservation, portability, and price. The food had to survive being dropped from planes, jostled in trucks for hundreds of miles, and stored in humid jungles or frozen trenches without spoiling. It needed to be lightweight enough for a soldier to carry alongside his ammunition and gear. Most importantly, it had to be cheap to produce on a scale the world had never seen. Flavor, that was a luxury, a distant afterthought, somewhere on the priority list below, won't cause immediate food poisoning, and doesn't look too much like its packaging. Each nation tackled this monumental problem with its own unique philosophy and resources. The Americans, with their industrial might and can-do spirit, attempted to engineer the perfect meal. They created compact, calorie-dense boxes of sustenance called K-Rations and D-Rations, each component precisely measured to fuel a fighting man. These rations were a triumph of nutritional science and a complete failure of culinary art, a little box of everything a body needed and nothing a soul wanted. The Germans began the war with a surprising focus on quality, sending their soldiers to the front with hearty sausages, dense rye bread, and real butter. They believed a well-fed soldier was an effective soldier. However, as the war dragged on and supply lines frayed, this commitment to quality eroded, replaced by a grim reliance on ersatz, or substitute, foods that often tasted like a cruel joke. The British, on the other hand, held on to their traditions with a death grip. Their rations were built around the sacred trinity of bully beef, hardtack, biscuits, and, above all, tea. For Britain, a cup of tea in a muddy foxhole wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual, a symbol of civilization holding on by a thread. The Soviet Union, fighting a brutal war of survival on its own soil, approached rations with stark pragmatism. Their soldiers were fueled by whatever was available, which usually meant cabbage, black bread, and buckwheat porridge, known as kasha. It was simple, monotonous, and often insufficient, but it was hot and it was food. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers were expected to embody the principle of endurance. They traveled light, often with little more than rice, pickled plums, and a sense of duty, taught that hunger itself was a form of training for the hardships of combat. Across every front, food became more than just fuel. It was a powerful tool of morale. A rare, hot meal delivered by a field kitchen could feel like a miracle, lifting the spirits of an entire platoon and reminding them of a life beyond the war. Conversely, the daily reality of a cold, greasy tin of unidentifiable meat could crush a man's spirit, another small misery in a sea of them. This dynamic created a thriving black market in the trenches, where soldiers bartered cigarettes for chocolate, cheese for crackers, and anything at all to escape another meal of the same grim ration. So tonight, we won't be focusing on grand strategies or the turning points of famous battles. Instead, we're going into the mess kits and the pockets of the everyday soldier. We're talking about Spam, powdered eggs, rock-hard biscuits, and the strange, suspicious contents of tins that fed the largest armed conflict in human history. This is the story of the war fought not with rifles, but with spoons and bayonets against food that sometimes fought back. Imagine you're a U.S. soldier in the heart of war-torn Europe. You've been marching for what feels like days. The damp cold has settled deep in your bones, and your stomach is rumbling with the force of a panzer division. A sergeant tosses you a small, wax-coated cardboard box. This is it. Your meal, your fuel, your brief respite from the chaos. This is the K-Ration, a compact, calorie-packed marvel of military logistics, and a profound culinary disappointment. It was designed by scientists who understood nutrition perfectly and flavor not at all. The K-Ration was ingeniously divided into 3 separate boxes for the day's meals: breakfast, dinner, and supper. Each box was about the size of a small book and just as dry. They were color-coded to prevent a soldier from accidentally eating his canned pork loaf for breakfast, a small mercy in a system otherwise devoid of it. These little boxes were supposed to contain everything a man needed to keep fighting, but they often felt more like a test of his will to live. Breakfast, the most important meal of the day, was an exercise in grim acceptance. The centerpiece was a small tin of something vaguely resembling meat, usually processed pork with egg product, which had the texture of firm sawdust mixed with grease. This was accompanied by a packet of instant coffee, a few lumps of sugar, and a fruit bar that tasted like a chemically treated fig. To round it out, you received 4 cigarettes and a stick of chewing gum, because nothing says balanced diet like nicotine and sugar before a firefight. The dinner unit, intended for midday, offered no redemption. It typically contained a can of processed cheese, a concoction so stable and uncheese-like that it could probably survive re-entry from orbit. With this, you received more of the infamous hard biscuits. These weren't crackers. They were dense, tooth-threatening slabs of baked flour and water that soldiers affectionately called jawbreakers or sheet iron. The box also included a packet of powdered lemonade, which, when mixed with canteen water, created a drink that was sour, sweet, and tasted vaguely of betrayal. As evening fell, the supper unit made its appearance. This box usually featured a canned meat product, often a beef and pork loaf that soldiers swore was made from whatever was swept off the factory floor. It was greasy, salty, and best eaten with your eyes closed. This was served with, you guessed it, more biscuits, another packet of coffee, or a bouillon cube to make a thin, salty broth, and perhaps a small chocolate bar if morale was deemed critically low. Despite the relentless blandness, the K-Ration was a nutritional powerhouse. The 3 daily boxes provided a soldier with approximately 2,830 calories, packed with proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. They were a miracle of wartime engineering, designed to keep a soldier marching, and fighting. Troops, however, were less concerned with the nutritional science, and more with surviving the meal itself. A thriving barter economy emerged in every foxhole, where a prized Hershey's bar could be traded for a handful of cigarettes, and a fruit bar could be swapped for a can of cheese. This constant trading and swapping was more than just a quest for better flavor. It was a way to reclaim a small piece of control in a world where there was none. It was a moment of connection and dark humor shared over a meal that was, at best, edible. Soldiers would often combine elements in desperate attempts to create something new, crushing biscuits into their canned meat to make a sort of battlefield meatloaf, or dissolving chocolate into hot water to create a beverage that almost felt like a luxury. The K-Ration was the fuel that powered the American war machine across North Africa, Italy, and France. It was a dry, monotonous, and deeply unloved necessity. Yet, for a soldier huddled in the cold, miles from home, that little cardboard box was often the only thing he had. It was a tangible link to the vast supply chain stretching all the way back home, a promise that, no matter how bad things got, he would not be left to starve. It was a taste of war itself, efficient, impersonal, and something you endured to get the job done. If the K-Ration was the bland, everyday reality of a soldier's diet, then the D-ration was the military's idea of an emergency threat disguised as a chocolate bar. It was issued in a wrapper that promised the sweet comfort of chocolate, but delivered a harsh lesson in military pragmatism. This wasn't a treat to be enjoyed. It was a block of bitter, concentrated survival, designed to be eaten only as a last resort when you were cold, alone, and convinced you were about to die. The D-ration bar, officially designated U.S. Army Field Ration D, was developed in 1937 in collaboration with the Hershey Chocolate Company. It was roughly the size of a modern energy bar, but possessed the density of a small planet. Composed of chocolate, sugar, oat flour, and cocoa fat, it was engineered to be three things: high in energy, resistant to heat up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and, most critically, to taste, in the words of the Quartermaster General, a little better than a boiled potato. The Army specifically requested it be unappetizing, fearing that if it were too tasty, soldiers would eat it as a snack instead of saving it for an actual emergency. On this last point, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The bar was so hard and dense that many soldiers joked it could be used to patch tires or hammer in tent stakes. Trying to bite directly into a D-ration was a risky proposition, often leading to cracked teeth and sore jaws. Soldiers developed a variety of techniques to make it edible, from slowly shaving off slivers with a knife, to grating it into their canteen cups with hot water, to create a lukewarm, sludgy beverage that was only slightly less depressing than eating the bar raw. Despite its profoundly uninviting nature, the D-ration was a potent source of calories. Each bar contained about 600 calories, a compact burst of energy that could sustain a soldier through a day of intense combat or a long, cold night trapped behind enemy lines. It was the ultimate emergency food. If you were lost, wounded, or cut off from your unit, that dense, bitter brick in your pocket might just be the thing that kept you alive until help arrived. It wasn't meant for morale. It was meant for survival, pure and simple. The psychological effect of the D-ration was something else entirely. It became a symbol of military logic at its most extreme, a food item intentionally made to be disliked. Troops would curse it, trade it for almost anything else, or keep it at the bottom of their packs as a grim reminder of how much worse things could get. Legends and jokes about the narration were common, with soldiers swearing they'd seen it deflect shrapnel, or that it was the secret ingredient in bunker concrete. To the Army's credit, they did eventually listen to the chorus of complaints from the front lines. Later versions of the ration were reformulated to be slightly softer and a bit more palatable, but the legend of the original D-ration was already forged in the collective memory of the GIS. It was the bar that tasted of survival, a bitter, rock-hard testament to the fact that in war, even something as comforting as chocolate could be turned into a tool of grim necessity. This bar was a lesson in expectations. It looked like a treat, was called chocolate, but delivered a payload of gritty, waxy, life-sustaining disappointment. It was the perfect metaphor for so many aspects of a soldier's life, the promise of comfort clashing with the harsh reality of the mission. The ration wasn't food in the way a home-cooked meal was food. It was fuel in its most crude and unapologetic form. The legacy of the ration lives on in military lore as the quintessential example of function over form. It was a lifesaver that every soldier hoped he would never have to eat. It achieved its mission perfectly by being so thoroughly unpleasant that it was only consumed in the direst of circumstances. A bitter pill that could, quite literally, keep a heart beating. It was, without a doubt, the most unloved and yet most vital piece of chocolate in history. When a soldier's world had been reduced to the cold, metallic taste of canned rations and the gritty reality of life in a foxhole, one sight on the horizon could bring more hope than a fleet of bombers. The field kitchen. These were the Army's mobile food factories, often little more than a kitchen on wheels pulled behind a truck or a team of stubborn mules. They were the soldiers' only chance at getting something warm, something that resembled a real meal, and something that wasn't served in a cardboard box. These rolling kitchens were tasked with the monumental job of turning raw bulk ingredients into thousands of meals, often while within earshot of enemy artillery. They churned out gargantuan vats of stews, gravies of questionable origin, boiled vegetables, and enough coffee to keep an entire infantry division awake for a week. The cooks who ran these kitchens were unsung heroes, armed with ladles instead of rifles, fighting their own daily war against spoilage, supply shortages, and the monumental task of making something edible out of very little. Mealtime was a familiar ritual. Soldiers would line up, clutching their trusty mess kits, a simple metal tray with compartments that had seen better days. As they shuffled forward, a wave of anticipation and anxiety would pass through the line. Would today be a good day? Would they get a decent scoop of stew, or just the watery broth from the bottom of the pot? The food was slopped onto their trays with military efficiency, one heaping ladle per man, a quick look from the cook, and then on to the next hungry soldier. The menu was notoriously inconsistent, but a few infamous dishes became legendary. Chief among them was creamed chipped beef on toast, a dish so iconic that soldiers gave it a permanent, affectionate, and unrepeatable nickname. The most common printable version is SOS, or stuff on a shingle. It was a salty, creamy, beefy concoction ladled over toast that could be heavenly when prepared well, and utterly demoralizing when it wasn't. It was the quintessential taste of Army life. The location of the war heavily influenced the menu. In the European theater, meals might consist of beef stew, potatoes, and bread. In the warmer climates of the Pacific, the field kitchens often worked with what they had, which could mean rice mixed with canned meat, hot dog fragments floating in a thin broth, or whatever local vegetables could be safely procured. But no matter the continent, one thing remained sacred: the coffee. It was brewed strong, bitter, and in quantities vast enough to float a battleship. It was the lifeblood of the army, served black, hot, and without apology. The dining experience itself was anything but glamorous. There were no tables or chairs. Soldiers ate wherever they could find a spot, sitting on their helmets, on ammunition crates, or on the cold, muddy ground. They ate in the rain, in the snow, and in the blistering heat, often with the sounds of battle echoing in the distance. The ambience was one of pure survival, a brief pause in the chaos to refuel the body before returning to the fight. Yet, for all its shortcomings, the food from a field kitchen was a profound comfort. A hot meal was a taste of normalcy, a reminder of a world away from the war. It meant that for a moment, you weren't just a number in a vast military machine, but a person eating a meal. It was a tangible sign that the supply lines were holding, that someone, somewhere, was looking out for you. In a world of cold rations and constant danger, the simple warmth of a scoop of stew was a luxury beyond measure. This brief connection to a more civilized life was a critical component of morale. The field kitchen didn't just serve food, it served hope. It was a promise that even in the heart of the conflict, the simple, human act of sharing a warm meal could endure. It wasn't home, but for a few precious minutes, it was the closest a soldier could get. At the outset of World War II, as the German military machine rolled into Poland and France with terrifying efficiency, its soldiers marched with a swagger that came from more than just confidence. They were, by the standards of the time, astonishingly well fed. While other armies were already grappling with the challenges of mass-produced bland sustenance, the early war Wehrmacht soldier enjoyed rations that were surprisingly hearty and resembled actual food. The standard ration pack for a German soldier was designed to be both nutritious and culturally familiar. Each man carried an iron ration intended to last for a few days of combat. This typically included dense, dark rye bread, a staple of the German diet, tins of meat, often high-quality pork or beef, hard sausages like metwurst, a small amount of real butter or schmaltz, hard cheese, and even a small jar of marmalade or jam for the bread. It was a far cry from the processed cheese and rock-hard biscuits of the American K-Ration. The German military philosophy was built around the ideal of providing 3 hot meals a day whenever possible. This ambitious goal was supported by highly efficient mobile field kitchens, known as Feldküchen, or, more colloquially, goulash cannons. These kitchens would follow the troops, ready to serve hot, comforting meals that felt like they came from a civilian kitchen, not a war zone. This emphasis on warm food was a massive boost to morale in the early campaigns. A typical day's menu for a German soldier in 1940 might start with a breakfast of that hearty rye bread, perhaps with a slice of sausage or a smear of jam washed down with coffee. Lunch would be a cold meal from the ration pack, more bread, tinned meat, and cheese. But dinner was the highlight. If the field kitchens were operational, soldiers could look forward to a steaming bowl of thick stew, boiled potatoes with gravy, or Eintopf, a traditional one-pot meal filled with meat and vegetables. Sausage, or wurst, was the backbone of the German ration system. It was durable, packed with protein and fat, and deeply comforting. Varieties like Leberwurst, liverwurst, and other preserved meats were staples. Their rich, savory flavor a welcome taste of home. Equally important was the bread. German soldiers cherished their dark, flavorful rye bread. For many, losing access to proper bread later in the war was a more significant blow to morale than losing territory. One veteran later recalled the ration bread as the only softness in an otherwise very sharp war. This early period of relative culinary luxury was a direct result of the German military's initial successes and short, manageable supply lines. The Blitzkrieg strategy, short, decisive campaigns, meant that food and supplies could keep up with the advancing armies. The occupation of fertile lands in France and Poland also allowed the Wehrmacht to supplement its rations by requisitioning local food supplies, further bolstering the quality of the soldiers' meals. However, this golden age of German rations was tragically short-lived. The system was designed for quick victories in Western Europe. It was not prepared for the vast, unforgiving distances and the brutal attritional warfare that would come to define the Eastern Front. As the war expanded, supply lines stretched to their breaking point, and the German war economy came under immense strain. For a brief, shining moment at the start of the war, the average German soldier was arguably the best fed in the world. His stomach was full, his morale was high, and the German command seemed to have perfected the art of fueling a modern army. But this bratwurst-fueled dream would soon curdle into a nightmare of ersatz substitutes and gnawing hunger. A story of decline we will explore next. As the initial Blitzkrieg victories gave way to the brutal, sprawling reality of a multi-front war, the German ration system began to collapse under its own weight. The hearty sausages and rich rye bread that fueled the invasion of France became a distant memory. By 1942, a new word came to define the German soldier's diet: ersatz. While the word technically means substitute, in the context of wartime Germany, it meant a pale, often tasteless imitation of real food, a grim testament to a nation stretching its resources to the breaking point. Nowhere was this decline more evident than in the soldier's coffee cup. Real coffee beans, an imported luxury, vanished almost completely. In their place came Ersatzkaffee, a beverage brewed from a bizarre collection of roasted ingredients like acorns, chicory, barley, and sugar beets. It had the dark color of coffee and the general warmth of a hot drink, but the similarity ended there. It was a bitter, woody brew that tasted more like disappointment than anything else, yet it was the only caffeine-like jolt available to millions of soldiers. The sacred German bread suffered a similar fate. The dense, flavorful rye loaves were gradually diluted with fillers to make the flour supplies last longer. Sawdust, straw, potato flour, and anything else that could be ground into a powder found its way into the dough. The resulting bread was tough, often tasteless, and hard on the digestive system. Soldiers joked that it could be used for helmet padding or building fortifications, a dark humor that masked the genuine pain of losing a fundamental comfort of home. Butter and fats, essential for a high-energy diet, also became a thing of the past. Real butter was replaced by a waxy, pale ersatz margarine that was oily and chalky at the same time. The high-quality tinned meats were superseded by cans of vaguely defined meat product. The labels rarely specified the animal, and soldiers learned it was probably better not to ask. Rumors of horse meat being used were not rumors, they were fact. Even the iconic German wurst was not safe from this decline. The one-sprout sausages were stretched with fillers like turnip, peas, and excess vegetable matter. By the later stages of the war, some sausages were composed of as much as 40% non-meat ingredients. Imagine biting into a bratwurst, expecting a taste of savory, spiced meat, and instead getting a mouthful of something that resembled damp cardboard. This was the new reality for the German soldier. This wasn't just a matter of bad taste. It was a crisis of nutrition. On the Eastern Front, soldiers were enduring sub-zero temperatures and engaging in intense physical labor, burning thousands of calories a day. The ersatz rations they were receiving simply didn't have the caloric or nutritional content to sustain them. Starvation, malnutrition, and diseases like scurvy became rampant, silently decimating the ranks as surely as enemy bullets. In the face of this, soldiers became endlessly inventive. They bartered with local populations, trading cigarettes or buttons for a single potato or a handful of grain. They foraged for wild plants, boiled tree bark, and in the most desperate of times, even cooked shoe leather. Raiding enemy supply lines became a high-risk, high-reward mission, not for intelligence or weapons, but for a can of American corned beef or a British chocolate bar, items that were suddenly more valuable than an Iron Cross. The German war machine had started its journey, powered by real food and high morale. Now, it was sputtering along on a fuel of caffeine lies, sawdust bread, and cabbage water. The decline in the quality of their rations was a mirror image of their declining fortunes on the battlefield. The taste of ersatz was the taste of a dream turning into a protracted and brutal nightmare. If there was a place where food went to die during World War II, it was the vast frozen hellscape of the Eastern Front. This was the logistical equivalent of trying to cater a banquet at the end of the world. For the German soldiers who once feasted on sausage and rye in France, the invasion of the Soviet Union marked the beginning of a long, slow descent into starvation. Here, in the endless snowdrifts and frozen mud, the German army's well-oiled supply system sputtered, froze, and collapsed. The rations that did make it to the front lines were often unrecognizable. Bread arrived, frozen solid and covered in mold, useful only as a paperweight or a grim reminder of home. Canned meats, the so-called iron ration, were often frozen into solid blocks of ice and grease. Soldiers would have to use precious fuel and firewood not to warm themselves, but to thaw a single can of mystery meat, chipping away at it with their bayonets. Often, the only hot meal available was a thin, watery soup. If you were lucky, it might contain a few potato peels or a stray cabbage leaf. If you were unlucky, it was just hot, salted water, which would often freeze again in the soldier's mess kit before he could finish it. In the depths of winter, men were forced to melt snow for drinking water, a dangerous task as consuming snow directly could fatally lower their core body temperature. Survival became a series of cruel calculations. The constant gnawing hunger drove men to desperate measures. The rats that infested the trenches, once seen as pests, were now viewed with a different eye. They were often described in letters home as being bold, fat, and suspiciously well-fed, a stark contrast to the emaciated soldiers they lived alongside. In the darkest moments, some units resorted to hunting these rats for an extra source of protein, a grim addition to their meager diet. Bartering became a matter of life and death. A single cigarette, once a casual pleasure, could now be traded for a crust of bread. A spare pair of socks might be exchanged for half a boiled potato. Soldiers traded away personal mementos, buttons from their uniforms, anything that might persuade a fellow soldier or a local peasant to part with a spoonful of sugar or a sliver of bacon. A piece of American chocolate looted from a dead enemy or a supply drop was a treasure beyond compare. The psychological toll of this unending hunger was immense. Mealtime, which should have been a moment of rest and camaraderie, became a ritual of dread and disappointment. Opening and unlabeled cans was a game of chance. Would it be beef, pork, or a tin of recycled optimism that had gone bad months ago? Hope dwindled with every empty calorie, and morale thawed even slower than the frozen ground. The German soldier on the Eastern Front was fighting a war on two fronts. In front of him was the relentless Red Army, but inside him was an even more insidious enemy, a gnawing, crippling hunger that sapped his strength, clouded his judgment, and hollowed him out from the inside. The once proud soldier of the Wehrmacht was being systematically dismantled, not just by bullets and shells, but by the slow, grinding misery of starvation. On the Eastern Front, food wasn't scarce, it was a ghost. It was a memory of a warm kitchen, a rumor carried on the wind, a cruel illusion in a landscape of ice and death. The war here was a brutal game of survival, played one frozen, agonizing spoonful at a time. The battle for food was as fierce and as deadly as any battle fought with tanks and guns. While German soldiers on the Eastern Front were learning the harsh lessons of starvation, their opponents, the soldiers of the Soviet Red Army, were already masters of enduring it. The Soviet approach to military nutrition was brutally simple and pragmatic. If it could fill a stomach and didn't immediately kill you, it was considered dinner. Theirs was a diet fueled less by calories and more by sheer, unyielding willpower. On paper, the official rations for a Red Army soldier were straightforward. The core of the diet consisted of coarse black bread, a hearty cabbage soup known as shi, and buckwheat porridge, or kasha. To this might be added a few boiled potatoes, some dried fish, and a supply of unsweetened tea, which in winter was often just melted snow with a few leaves or twigs thrown in for color. Meat was technically on the official ration list, but for the average soldier at the front, it was a rare and mythical beast. Its appearance was so infrequent that it was considered a cause for celebration. When meat did arrive, it was typically heavily salted for preservation, making it tough to chew and intensely salty. Still, soldiers would save every last scrap, sometimes licking the residual fat from empty tins just to get a fleeting taste. The true staples of the Soviet war diet were bread and cabbage. The black bread was dense, dark, and strictly rationed. A typical serving was a small, heavy slice that could fit in the palm of your hand. Soldiers would treasure this piece of bread, eating it slowly, crumb by crumb, to make it last. Cabbage, however, was the undisputed hero of Soviet cuisine. It was in everything: boiled, stewed, shredded into soups, or fermented. If there was a cooking pot, there was cabbage in it. Some soldiers joked that they could smell it in their sleep and dreamed of becoming turnips just to break the monotony. This diet, meager as it was often an optimistic projection. For soldiers in the thick of the fighting, daily rations were not a guarantee. Deliveries were often delayed for days or weeks by broken supply lines, enemy action, or the sheer, unforgiving vastness of the front. The official policy of daily rations often became when possible, which for many meant almost never. Soldiers routinely went into battle underfed and exhausted. This constant scarcity turned every soldier into an expert forager. They learned to live off the land with a desperate creativity. They dug up frozen potatoes from abandoned farm fields, hunted wild animals when ammunition could be spared, and became masters of making a meal out of next to nothing. Bartering was also common, with soldiers trading tobacco or spare uniform buttons with local villagers for a piece of bacon or a single precious egg. Yet, remarkably, morale did not collapse in the same way it did for their German counterparts. Soviet culture, steeped in hardship, often glorified suffering as a test of one's strength and commitment to the motherland. Deprivation was turned into a badge of honor. Soldiers told dark jokes about their meager rations, sang songs about dried fish, and developed a fierce pride in their ability to endure what other armies could not. The Red Army soldier pressed forward, malnourished but relentless. They fought with a ferocity that baffled their better-fed enemies. It was a stark lesson in the psychology of war. Sometimes what fuels a soldier isn't the food in his belly, but the fire in his heart. The Soviet war effort ran on a potent mixture of patriotism, camaraderie, and pure cabbage-fueled stubbornness. When the official supply trucks failed to arrive, which was a frequent occurrence, the Soviet soldier didn't simply lie down and starve. He adapted. With a mixture of ingenuity, desperation, and the culinary instincts of a hungry bear, Red Army troops elevated battlefield improvisation into a high art form. When the state couldn't provide, the soldier provided for himself. Foraging became an essential military skill, as important as marksmanship. Soldiers scoured the war-torn countryside for anything that was remotely edible. They dug up frozen root vegetables from abandoned gardens, picked wild berries and mushrooms, and learned to identify which grasses and leaves could be boiled into a thin, bitter soup. In the most extreme circumstances, men were known to boil tree bark to extract some meager sustenance, or even attempt to soften and chew on boiled shoe leather, not because it was nutritious, but because it gave their stomach something to do. Bartering was the engine of the unofficial trench economy. A soldier's personal kit became his currency. A spare pair of warm socks might be worth a handful of potatoes. A piece of soap was a luxury that could command a high price. Tobacco, especially the potent makorka, was as good as gold, traded for bread, lard, or information. And if a soldier managed to get his hands on captured enemy rations, a tin of American Spam or a German sausage, he was treated like a king, at least until the food ran out. The Soviet field kitchens, when they were able to operate, were masters of what could be called mystery cooking. The cooks, often as hungry as the men they were feeding, threw whatever they could find into their massive cauldrons: beets, onions, a few scraps of salted meat, wild vegetables, and sometimes pickled goods of a questionable vintage, all went into the pot. The resulting soup was usually red, hot, and suspiciously chewy, but it was a lifeline that kept men going. This culture of improvisation also extended to their equipment. A soldier's helmet, when not protecting his head, often doubled as a cooking pot or a water basin. An empty artillery shell casing could be fashioned into a makeshift cup. A bayonet wasn't just a weapon. It was a skewer for roasting a piece of scavenged meat over a fire, a tool for digging up roots, or a spatula for frying a potato on a heated piece of scrap metal. These shared acts of creation and survival forged intense bonds of camaraderie. Huddling around a small, smoky fire, sharing a meager stew made from foraged ingredients, was a powerful ritual. It was a moment of defiance against the cold, the hunger, and the chaos of the war. They told jokes, sang songs, and shared stories, turning a desperate meal into a temporary island of humanity. This resourcefulness also had a more aggressive side, often referred to by the euphemism of unauthorized logistics. This meant raiding abandoned enemy positions, or even making risky forays behind enemy lines, not for strategic advantage, but simply for food. The sheer joy described by veterans who discovered a forgotten German supply cache is telling. One soldier recalled finding a box of Wehrmacht sausages, stating, "It was the first time I cried and salivated at the same time." In the Red Army, mealtime wasn't just about eating. It was a performance of resilience. Every bowl of improvised borscht, every traded crust of bread, was a declaration that they were still there, still fighting, and still human. They were turning the harshness of the land against their invaders, proving that an army could run not just on official rations, but on grit, ingenuity, and an unbreakable will to survive. If World War II were to be judged on culinary merit alone, the British Army might have been politely asked to surrender to its own menu. For the British soldier, known affectionately as the Tommy, eating was less a pleasure and more a duty. His rations were a daily trial of unseasoned, monotonous punishment, a war within the war that was endured with a stiff upper lip, eternal optimism, and as much tea as a human being could possibly consume. The British soldier's diet revolved around a sacred and deeply uninspiring trinity: tea, hardtack biscuits, and bully beef. These three items formed the bedrock of his sustenance, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma. They were reliable, they were plentiful, and they were, for the most part, profoundly joyless. First, and most importantly, there was tea. Tea was everything. It was more than a beverage. It was liquid morale, a ritual that connected a soldier in a muddy trench to a peaceful garden back in England. Troops brewed it in their tin mugs, in their helmets, in anything that could hold water and withstand heat. Often there was no milk and no sugar, just hot, brown water that tasted faintly of hope. But it was warm, it was familiar, and it got them through the day. Next were the hardtack biscuits. These were not the flaky, buttery biscuits one might imagine. These were dense, chalky, and almost entirely devoid of flavor, with the structural integrity of a paving stone. They were designed to outlive the British Empire itself, and probably could have. Soldiers joked that they were better used as plates, coasters, or as makeshift armor in a pinch. Many veterans later claimed that their dental problems originated not from combat, but from a foolhardy attempt to bite into a hardtack biscuit. Finally, there was bully beef. This was the British term for tinned corned beef, a product that had the visual appeal of pink gravel and the consistency of greasy sawdust. It was a salty, fatty, and strangely fibrous substance that could be eaten hot, cold, or with a deep sense of resignation. Soldiers would slice it, fry it, dice it into stews, or simply stare at it until their appetite packed its bags and left the tent. The rest of the standard ration pack was a collection of other tinned wonders. There were powdered eggs, which, through some unholy alchemy, managed to taste nothing like actual eggs. There was tinned jam, so thick and sugary it could seemingly glue a man's jaw shut, and there was a smattering of oatmeal, a small bar of chocolate, and some dried fruit, all of which came in tins that required a bayonet, a strong will, and a silent prayer to open. The British military didn't pretend its food was gourmet. The official line was that it was sufficient to keep a soldier fighting, and in that they were technically correct. Field kitchens sometimes offered a welcome reprieve with a hot stew, stewed prunes, or, on a truly glorious day, a real egg. But these were exceptions to the rule of tinned monotony. No matter how grim the food, there was always tea. Shells could be falling, tanks could be on fire, but if a soldier could get some water to boil, he could have a brew-up. And in that simple, steaming mug, held in a muddy trench thousands of miles from home, was Britain's greatest ration of all, pure, unadulterated stubbornness in a cup. By the middle of the war, British soldiers were engaged in a fight on two fronts, one against the Axis powers, and another against a far more insidious enemy called ration fatigue. This was the invisible, soul-crushing weariness that came from eating the same tin of corned beef for the 1000th time. The British military supply system, a sprawling global network held together by paperwork, hope, and an impressive number of forms filled out in triplicate, struggled to keep its men fed across multiple continents. The vastness of the British Empire meant that soldiers were fighting in every conceivable environment, and the rations had to endure it all. A tin of bully beef sent to the scorching deserts of North Africa might arrive warm and ready to eat, but a ration pack sent to the dense, humid jungles of Burma faced a different ordeal. There, the relentless moisture caused tins to rust, biscuits to grow mold, and everything to taste vaguely of damp earth. Supplies often arrived weeks late, half-eaten by ants, and generally worse for wear. In these harsh environments, the simple act of boiling water became a sacred ritual. It was necessary not only to kill the rampant bacteria in local water sources, but, more importantly, because boiling water meant tea. The kettle was a cherished piece of equipment, and soldiers would go to great lengths to protect it. A warm cup of tea was a moment of defiant civilization in the mud and chaos, a small victory against the encroaching wilderness. When supplies were tight, as they often were, the Tommies got creative. They became masters of making do, using their bayonets as spatulas to spread jam on their hardtack biscuits. They rehydrated powdered milk into a thin, ghostly white fluid to add to their tea. In moments of culinary desperation, they would combine ration components into strange new concoctions. One unit in North Africa famously mixed bully beef with dried fruit and called it Desert Delight, a dish that was morally questionable but technically food. The packaging itself was a constant source of frustration. The tins that preserved the food were a blessing for their durability and a curse for their impenetrability. Opening one often required more strength and ingenuity than building a bridge. Soldiers developed strong opinions on tin design, spending long afternoons debating the merits of the tins with a built-in Kirill opener versus the dreaded devil tins that had no easy open mechanism at all. On the rare occasion that fresh food made an appearance, it was treated with a mixture of celebration and suspicion. A real egg, a loaf of actual bread, or a fresh vegetable was a treasure to be marveled at. One soldier, upon being given a fresh tomato for the first time in months, purportedly stared at it for an hour, unsure of what to do with it, before deciding to keep it as a pet. It was a poignant symbol of just how disconnected from normal life they had become. Despite the monotonous diet, the logistical headaches, and the jaw-breaking biscuits, the British troops remained famously stoic. They grumbled with a unique sense of dignity, made dark jokes about their own digestion, and perfected the art of complaining without ever truly losing their resolve. They were sustained not by the quality of their food, but by a deep-seated resilience. And through it all, they clung to their rituals, they kept calm and carried on, fueled by a sense of duty and an unshakable belief in the restorative power of a proper cup of tea. It was this spirit, as much as any ration, that saw them through the darkest days of the war. If the American soldier was fueled by science, the German by sausage, and the Brit by tea, then the soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army was fueled by rice and an almost terrifying capacity for suffering. The entire Japanese military philosophy was built on the principle of endurance. Soldiers were taught that self-denial was a virtue, that complaining was a sign of weakness, and that hunger was simply another part of their solemn duty to the emperor. This was a convenient ideology, as most of them were perpetually starving. The standard Japanese field ration was less of a meal and more of a minimalist suggestion of one. The typical pack was compact and culturally familiar, containing mainly polished white rice, sometimes mixed with barley. This was supplemented with a small amount of dried fish, some intensely salty pickled plums, known as yumiboshi, a bit of soy sauce, concentrate, and perhaps a few hard candies for a fleeting burst of sugar. At the start of their campaigns, these rations were packed with typical Japanese neatness and order. Soldiers would set out with several days' worth of food, often wrapped carefully in wax paper or stored in bento-style metal tins. It was a system that looked clean, organized, and well thought out. And then it met the jungle. In the brutal, humid battlegrounds of the Pacific, places like New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and Burma, this system catastrophically failed. The relentless humidity turned the precious rice into a moldy, inedible paste in a matter of days. Rats and insects devoured supplies with impunity. The dried fish would spoil in the heat, creating a smell that was almost as bad as the hunger itself. The neat little packages of food turned into packets of rot. Compounding this problem was the fact that Japan's military logistics were, to put it generously, a complete disaster. Supply lines were overstretched, frequently bombed by Allied forces, or, in some cases, simply forgotten. It was not uncommon for entire divisions to be cut off from resupply for weeks or even months at a time. They were left to fend for themselves in some of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. This led to widespread starvation on a scale that was unique among the major powers. Soldiers were forced to forage in jungles that were alien to them, filled with unfamiliar and often poisonous plants. They hunted whatever they could find: lizards, insects, snakes, and rats. In one soldier's account, he described making a soup from boiled grass and scraps of boot leather, not for nutrition, but just to trick the stomach into feeling full. Yet, through all of this, Japanese troops rarely complained. They were deeply indoctrinated with a warrior code that viewed hardship as a spiritual test. Starving was seen as honorable. A barefoot soldier was inspirational. And if their meager rice ration was infested with weevils, it was dismissed as simply added protein. There were occasional prized items like miso paste or powdered green tea, which were hoarded and shared with ceremonial gravity. A single pinch of salt could be enough to bring a grown man to tears of gratitude. Ultimately, the Japanese soldier was not just underfed. He was trained to embrace being underfed. He was expected to fight with the same ferocity on an empty stomach as a full one. In the end, many of them kept fighting, not because of what was in their bellies, which was often nothing, but because of the iron-willed discipline and fierce ideology that had been forged in their minds. The jungles of the Pacific, from a distance, might have looked like a paradise, but for the soldiers fighting within them, especially the Japanese, this lush, green world was a death trap with humidity and a hostile attitude. The jungle wasn't a source of food. It was a leafy, suffocating enemy that conspired with the climate to destroy men, machines, and morale. It was a place where survival was measured in hours, not days. Supply lines in the Pacific were notoriously fragile. Tropical storms could delay ships for weeks. Allied submarines hunted transport vessels, and dense jungle terrain made overland delivery nearly impossible. Every bag of rice, every tin of fish, every packet of salt that made it to the front lines was a small miracle. And when the miracles stopped, the jungle did not provide. The environment itself was an aggressive foe to their food supplies. The crushing humidity caused canned goods to rust shut, often becoming impossible to open without heavy tools. The precious rice, the very staple of their diet, would grow a thick coat of green or black mold almost overnight. One soldier on Guadalcanal wrote in his diary, "Everything here is wet. Even my appetite is damp." When official rations disappeared entirely, the men had to rely on the land. If they were lucky, they might catch a frog, a snake, or a jungle fowl. They might find a patch of edible wild yams or a fruit they recognized. But more often, they were unlucky. They resorted to boiling the bark from trees or the tough, fibrous stems of rotting palm trees to create a thin, unfulfilling broth. They learned that what looked edible was often poisonous, a lesson many paid for with their lives. In their desperation, soldiers developed grim techniques to stretch what little they had. There are accounts of units boiling the same small handful of rice over and over again, each time producing a weaker, thinner gruel. The first boil produced something resembling porridge, the second, a starchy water, the third, a cloudy liquid barely distinguishable from the swamp water it was boiled in. This was a slow, losing battle against starvation. And then there were the darkest stories, the grim footnote that strips away any romance from the Pacific theater. In the most isolated and desperate units, cut off and starving for months, there were verified accounts of cannibalism. It was not widespread, and it was a practice born of the final stages of human desperation, but it happened. Men, driven to the absolute edge by the horrors of war and the shrieking emptiness of their stomachs, were forced to make the most terrible choice imaginable. Disease was a constant companion to hunger. Malnutrition shattered the soldiers' immune systems, leaving them vulnerable to the host of tropical illnesses the jungle offered. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and jungle rot became rampant. Many soldiers never saw combat. They simply wasted away in makeshift sick bays, their bodies broken not by enemy bullets, but by the slow, invisible ravages of infection and starvation. The jungle didn't care which side you were on. It did not feed you. It did not shelter you. It simply waited, patient and impartial. It waited for you to get tired, to get sick, to get hungry, and then it consumed you. The war in the Pacific wasn't just a fight against the Allies. For many, it was a fight against the jungle itself, a battle for survival that few could win. War may destroy cities and landscapes, but it also sparks a strange and desperate kind of creativity, especially in the makeshift kitchens of the front lines. Across every theater of the war, soldiers didn't just passively eat their rations. They negotiated with them, performed surgery on them, and engaged in mad science experiments to make them vaguely edible. This was wartime alchemy, turning the lead of military-issue food into the fleeting gold of a satisfying meal. In the American foxholes, WWII became masters of repurposing their K-Rations. They would crush the rock-hard biscuits into a powder, mix it with powdered eggs and a little water, and fry the resulting paste over a small fire to create something resembling a pancake. It was a gritty, joyless pancake, but it was warm. They melted the chemical-tasting cheese over hot beans to create trench fondue and would pan-fry slices of Spam until crispy, sandwiching them between two biscuits to make the world's most depressing yet cherished sandwich. The British Tommies, armed with their indestructible hardtack and tins of bully beef, had their own rituals. They created jam buddies by smashing two biscuits together with a thick layer of jam, a concoction that threatened to weld their teeth together. In North Africa, one unit famously mixed their bully beef with dried fruit and called it Desert Delight, a testament to the fact that you can call something a delight, even if it absolutely isn't. On the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers, blessed with very little, became experts in maximization. They used their own helmets as communal soup pots, boiling cabbage and scavenged potatoes for hours to extract every last bit of flavor and nutrition. Anything that could be caught was roasted over an open fire on a bayonet skewer. The defense of a captured German sausage was a group effort, a sacred duty to protect a rare treasure from thieves and the elements. Even the Japanese soldiers, with their severely limited supplies, found ways to innovate. Leftover rice would be mixed with pickled vegetables and molded into compact cakes, similar to onigiri, that were easier to carry and eat on the move. A precious piece of dried seaweed would be hoarded, used to add a savory, salty flavor to the plain hot water that often served as their only drink. It was about making the most of next to nothing. These weren't gourmet creations, they were acts of defiance. They were a way to fight back against the crushing boredom and monotony of their daily rations. It was a way to turn not enough into this will do for today. It was a small act of control in a world that offered none. Frying a piece of meat, boiling a soup, or successfully creating a biscuiton jam sandwich was a small, personal victory. The soldier's mess kit became his kitchen. His bayonet became his spatula. His helmet became his cooking pot. This shared experience of trying to make bad food better was a universal language spoken in every trench and foxhole. It didn't matter what flag was on your uniform. The struggle to make a decent meal was a battle everyone was fighting. These improvised meals were more than just food. They were a sign of life, a testament to the enduring human spirit's ability to find comfort and create order in the midst of utter chaos. Every meal was a small miracle, not just because of the food itself, but because it meant you had survived long enough to be hungry again. Long after the guns fell silent and the soldiers returned home, long after the uniforms were packed away and the medals were placed in drawers, one thing remained with the veterans of World War II with startling clarity: the food. More than just sustenance, the rations they ate became the sensory backdrop to their entire wartime experience. The taste and smell of their meals were forever intertwined with memories of fear, camaraderie, boredom, and hope. For many, a single flavor could instantly transport them back decades. For a British veteran, the salty, fatty taste of bully beef could conjure the exact feeling of sitting in a damp foxhole in the rain. For a Soviet veteran, the smell of boiling cabbage could bring back the bitter cold of a Russian winter. And for countless American GEs, the mere sight of a can of Spam was a direct link to a mess kit in a world far from home. These weren't just memories. They were visceral, full-body experiences. Veterans often processed these memories with a unique and dark sense of humor. One veteran claimed he couldn't stand the sight of bread for years after the war, not because he hated it, but because the abundance felt wrong after years of treasuring every last crumb. This humor was a shared language, a way for them to acknowledge the absurdity and hardship they had all endured. Food often marked the invisible boundaries of a soldier's world. Finding a fresh apple in an abandoned orchard meant you were in a place that still knew peace. Seeing a field kitchen churn out hot stew was a sign that you weren't going to die that day. Even a cup of terrible bitter coffee was a reassurance that the vast, complex machinery of the army was still running, that someone, somewhere, cared enough to boil water. Then there were the care packages from home. These were more than just food. They were emotional lifelines. A box containing chocolate bars, dried fruit, hand-knitted socks, and cookies was a tangible piece of the world they had left behind. The handwritten notes tucked inside were read and reread until they fell apart. These packages were a powerful reminder of what they were fighting for. The contents of these boxes were treated with the reverence of holy relics. Some soldiers would hoard their treats, rationing them out one small bite at a time, stretching the feeling of home across weeks of grim reality. Others would share them freely, the act of giving away a precious cookie becoming a profound moment of friendship and solidarity in the face of deprivation. Yet, for some, the flavors of war were a burden that never left. Many veterans reported that they could still taste the metallic temps of the tin cans decades later. One former soldier swore he could still smell the distinct odor of powdered eggs every time it rained. These were not fond memories. They were the ghosts of meals past, a permanent association between a specific taste and a moment of trauma. Because when you eat in a war, you are doing more than just feeding your body. You are anchoring yourself to the world. You are trying to stay human in a world that has gone mad. And that means that every meal, no matter how bland, how bizarre, or how wonderful, becomes an indelible part of who you are. The taste of survival is a taste that never truly fades away. The ink was barely dry on the U.S. Constitution when the young republic found itself facing its first major domestic crisis. This threat came not from foreign armies or royal navies, but from within its own borders, sparked by something deeply American and highly potent: whiskey. In the early 1790s, this humble spirit would put the new nation and its revered leader to a test they couldn't afford to fail. Fresh off the Revolutionary War, America was financially crippled. The nation was buried under a mountain of debt, and the new federal government, led by President George Washington and his ambitious Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, desperately needed to raise money. Hamilton, a brilliant and often controversial fiscal architect, proposed a solution: a federal excise tax on domestically produced distilled spirits. Whiskey, being the most popular and widely produced spirit, was the primary target. To the politicians, bankers. But out on the rugged western frontier, in places like western Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Virginia, the tax didn't sound reasonable at all. To the farmers and settlers living there, it sounded like a betrayal, a direct attack on their way of life by a distant government of powdered Wiggleets. On the frontier, whiskey wasn't just a beverage for unwinding after a long day. It was the very engine of the local economy. Farmers who lived far from major markets found it difficult and expensive to transport. Their bulky harvests of corn and rye over the rough Appalachian Mountains. It was far easier and more profitable to distill that grain into whiskey. The resulting liquor was less perishable, easier to transport, and served as a common form of currency, used to barter for goods and pay for services. When the federal government decided to tax their whiskey, these frontiersmen felt a profound sense of injustice. Many were veterans of the Revolutionary War who believed they had fought to escape exactly this kind of taxation without fair representation. They saw the federal government beginning to act just like the British Crown they had overthrown, a remote, powerful authority imposing its will on hard-working people who had no real voice in the matter. To make matters worse, the structure of the tax seemed deliberately designed to punish the small-scale farmer. Large distilleries in the East could afford to pay a flat annual fee, which was more manageable, but small, independent distillers, the kind that populated the Western Hills, were forced to pay a tax on every gallon they produced. This meant the little guy, who could least afford it, often paid a higher rate proportionally. At first, the resistance was disorganized but defiant. Federal tax collectors who ventured into the western counties were met with threats and intimidation. Tax documents were burned, and revenue officers were chased out of town. But soon, the protests turned violent. Taxmen were ambushed, their homes were attacked, and their authority was openly mocked. What started as a protest over a tax was quickly spiraling into an open, armed rebellion. It became a direct challenge to the authority of the new United States government. From his presidential office, George Washington watched these events unfold with growing concern. He knew that how he responded would set a precedent for the future of the Republic and would determine whether by 1792, the whiskey tax wasn't just an unpopular policy. It had become radioactive. In the backcountry communities of western Pennsylvania, the opposition was hardening from scattered grumbles into organized, armed defiance. For federal tax collectors, the region was quickly becoming a no-go zone for federal authority. The western counties of Pennsylvania became the epicenter of what many in the East were starting to call an outright rebellion. This wasn't just a disorganized mob. Meetings were held in taverns and public squares where barrels of homemade whiskey stood proudly next to stacked rifles. Locals formed their own militias, issued direct threats to federal officials, and passed resolutions that effectively declared the federal tax null and void in their territory. This was a community-wide resistance. They employed social and economic pressure, with rebels refusing to do business with any farmer, merchant, or craftsman who complied with the tax. If you paid your whiskey tax, you might find that no one would buy your grain. The blacksmith wouldn't shoe your horse, and you were ostracized from the community. It was a powerful tool of enforcement, a local law that superseded the federal one. The violence and intimidation escalated throughout 1793. Tax collectors and their sympathizers were not just threatened, they were ambushed, whipped, and publicly humiliated, and then tarred and feathered before being left tied to a tree in the woods. This was frontier justice, fueled by cheap liquor and a deep-seated resentment of authority. The federal government tried to respond through the courts. It issued summonses for the ringleaders to appear in Philadelphia and face charges. But trying to serve legal papers in these counties was a fool's errand. The local sheriffs were often sympathetic to the rebels or too intimidated to carry out their duties. The region was effectively slipping into a state of lawlessness, governed by revolutionary committees and mob rule. President Washington, a man who valued order and the rule of law, above all else, watched these developments with a heavy heart. He understood that the Whiskey Rebellion was now threatening the very foundation of the new government. If a faction of citizens could openly defy federal law through violence and intimidation without consequence, then the Constitution was meaningless. The entire American experiment could unravel before it had even truly begun. Still, Washington preferred peace to confrontation. He sent federal commissioners to the region to negotiate with the rebel leaders, hoping to find a peaceful resolution. But it was like trying to reason with a forest fire. The rebels, feeling empowered by their success, made bold demands and talked openly of secession from the United States. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton was constantly in Washington's ear, arguing that a powerful military response was the only way to prove that the federal government was not a joke. After months of failed negotiations and escalating violence, Washington came to a stark realization. The moment for talk had passed. He made a decision that would stun the nation and cement his legacy as a firm executive. He would raise a federal army and march west to crush the rebellion himself. The time had come to answer a critical question. Was the United States a single, indivisible nation under law, or was it a fragile collection of states that could be defied at will? By 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had evolved from a backcountry tax dispute into an existential crisis for the United States. In response, George Washington made a decision that would be unimaginable today. This was no small police action. Washington, invoking his authority under the recently passed Militia Acts, called upon the governors of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia to supply troops. A massive federal force of more than 12,000 soldiers was marshaled, an army nearly as large as the one he had commanded for most of the Revolutionary War. This colossal force wasn't preparing to fight the British or the French. It was marching west to confront angry farmers armed with pitchforks, homemade whiskey, and a rebellious spirit. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, who had advocated for this show of force from the beginning, was ecstatic. He saw this as the ultimate test of his vision for a powerful and respected federal government. Washington, however, was more reluctant. He was not a man who reveled in conflict, especially against fellow Americans. But he understood the profound stakes. This wasn't really about whiskey anymore. It was about whether the United States could survive as a nation governed by law. If a small group of rebels could use violence to nullify an act of Congress, then the Constitution was nothing more than a piece of paper, and the country could easily fracture into chaos. And so, for the first and only time in American history, a sitting president personally led troops into the field. Imagine the scene. George Washington, the most famous and revered man in America, astride his horse, riding at the head of a vast army as it snaked its way west through the rugged Allegheny Mountains. His objective was not to inspire a revolution, as he had done a decade earlier, but to crush one. His presence sent a powerful and chilling message across the frontier. This was not some distant, faceless government sending tax collectors. This was Washington himself, the father of the country, coming to restore order. The message was clear and unambiguous. Rebellion against the laws of the United States would be met not with more negotiations, but with overwhelming and decisive force. As the federal army, with Washington at its head, drew closer to the heart of the rebellion in western Pennsylvania, a strange thing happened. The rebellion, which had been so loud and violent for years, began to evaporate. The tough-talking leaders, who had incited mobs and torched homes, suddenly remembered they had farms to tend to, or urgent business elsewhere. Most of them vanished into the wilderness or quietly blended back into the population. There would be no climactic battle, no heroic last stand for the rebels. The Federal Army had marched for hundreds of miles to confront an enemy that simply melted away at its approach. The sheer scale and determination of the Federal response had smothered the uprising before a single major shot was fired. Washington's gamble had paid off. The rebellion was over, but the work of federal justice was just beginning. With the rebellion effectively smothered before a single battle was fought, the massive Federal Army's mission shifted from combat to law enforcement. George Washington, having made his point, handed control of the forces to subordinates and returned to Philadelphia. Now came the mop-up operation, rounding up the ringleaders and bringing them to justice, federal style. The arrests, however, proved to be as anticlimactic as the military confrontation. Most of the prominent and radical agitators, having heard of the approaching army, had long since fled into the wilderness or across the Ohio River into territory where federal marshals had little reach. What the army found were the less cautious, the less important, or simply the unluckiest of the rebels, who were too slow to hide. About 150 men were rounded up initially, but most were soon released due to a lack of evidence. Ultimately, around 20 individuals were identified as key participants and were marched back east to Philadelphia to stand trial for the most serious crime against a nation: treason. This was meant to be the final legal demonstration of federal power. The trials, however, did not unfold as the more hawkish Federalists like Alexander Hamilton might have wished. The government's case was often weak. Physical evidence was scarce. Witnesses were reluctant to testify against their neighbors, and the Philadelphia juries, composed of fellow Pennsylvanians, were not exactly eager to see these men hang. The defense argued that these were not traitors, but protesters, and the line between riot and rebellion was hotly debated. In the end, only 2 men were actually convicted of treason. These weren't the architects of the rebellion or powerful warlords. They were ordinary men, one a poor farmer and the other a simple-minded man who had been swept up in the popular fury and had made some very poor decisions. The verdict was in, and the penalty for treason was death. The fate of these 2 men now rested in the hands of one person: President Washington. In a move that defined his presidency, Washington chose mercy over vengeance. He issued a full pardon to both of the convicted men. He reasoned that the primary goal of the expedition, to demonstrate that the federal government could and would enforce its laws, had already been achieved. The massive army had proven the government's strength. Now, with the pardons, he would demonstrate its wisdom and compassion. This act of clemency was as powerful as the show of force itself. The message was clear. Yes, the government would meet rebellion with an iron fist, but it would not become a tyrant in the process. It sought to restore order, not to crush its citizens. This was a crucial step in reassuring a nervous public that the new federal government would not behave like the European monarchies they had fought to escape. Meanwhile, Hamilton and his supporters grumbled. They believed that a few hangings would have sent a much stronger message and discouraged future rebellions. But Washington understood the deeper game. The legitimacy of the new republic depended on balancing authority with justice. The Whiskey Rebellion was over, its leaders scattered, and its participants forgiven. But the political divisions it had exposed were only just beginning to fester. Though the guns were holstered and the rebels were pardoned, the Whiskey Rebellion left a political hangover that would last for years. The event had successfully proven that the new federal government possessed the power and the will to enforce its laws. But in doing so, it also ignited the smoldering embers of political division, helping to forge the nation's first true political parties and setting the stage for decades of ideological conflict. At the heart of the debate were two fundamentally opposing visions for America. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. They were lovers of order, commerce, and a strong, centralized government capable of ensuring stability. To them, the rebellion was clear proof that the unruly, democratic spirit of the countryside needed to be managed with a firm hand to prevent the nation from descending into anarchy. On the other side were Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the emerging Democratic Republican Party. They deeply distrusted centralized power, believing it would inevitably lead to tyranny. They championed the rights of the common man, the yeoman farmer, and believed that true liberty resided in local control. To them, the federal response to the rebellion was not a heroic act of law enforcement. It was a terrifying overreaction. The Republicans argued that sending a massive army of 12,000 soldiers to deal with a few hundred angry farmers was like using a cannon to squash a fly. Thomas Jefferson, who was serving as Washington's Secretary of State during the early stages of the crisis, privately condemned the military expedition. He believed that Washington's show of force was a monarchical display designed to intimidate the populace and alienate the common man from his own government. And in many ways, Jefferson was right. In the aftermath of the rebellion, something curious happened. The Federalist Party, despite its victory, began to lose support, especially in the rural and frontier areas. The government's heavy-handed approach had validated the worst fears of those who were already suspicious of federal authority. These people didn't see a government protecting them. They saw a government threatening them. This wave of anti-federalist sentiment was a political gift to the Republican Party. The frontier settlers, who felt ignored and punished by the Eastern elites, were no longer just a scattered group of angry farmers. They were now a galvanized political bloc with a clear grievance. They began to organize, vote, and rally behind the Republican cause, which they saw as the true heir to the spirit of the 1776 Revolution. So, while the Whiskey Rebellion was a military failure for the rebels, it was, in a strange way, a major political success for their underlying cause. It helped accelerate the formation of the first American party system, sharpening the divide between those who trusted a strong national government and those who feared it. The lines were drawn more clearly than ever before. The battle over whiskey was over, but a new kind of battle had just begun. This one would be fought not with muskets and torches in the hills of Pennsylvania, but with ballots, pamphlets, and fiery speeches in the halls of Congress and in town squares across the country. The soul of the young republic was up for grabs. At its core, the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't just about a tax on liquor. It was fueled by a deep and bitter sense of class resentment. To the small farmers of western Pennsylvania and beyond, the conflict was a clear case of the rich versus the poor. They saw a new federal government that seemed to be run by and for the wealthy eastern elites, the bankers, merchants, and speculators, at the direct expense of the hard-working man on the frontier. Many of the participants in the rebellion were not lawless criminals. They were veterans of the Revolutionary War. These were men who had fought and bled for the ideals of liberty and a representative government. They returned from the battlefields to their small farms, only to discover that the very government they had helped create was now imposing a tax that threatened their livelihood, all while cozying up to the moneyed interests back east. It felt like a profound betrayal. This sense of resentment was amplified by a feeling of deliberate political exclusion. Life on the frontier was a world away from the polished drawing rooms of Philadelphia. The Westerners felt their voices were drowned out in Congress, where representation was often dominated by the wealthier and more populous Eastern states. To them, the whiskey tax was a perfect symbol of their marginalization, a policy created by people who had no understanding of their lives and no interest in their well-being. The way the law was enforced only added to this sense of a class-based war. A wealthy distiller in the East could afford to hire lawyers, navigate the complex paperwork, and pay the annual flat fee. But the poor farmer, with a single still and a few barrels of mash, got a visit from a federal marshal and the threat of being dragged hundreds of miles from his home to face trial in a federal court. The optics were terrible, and the anger it generated was very real. In this charged atmosphere, some of the more radical rebels began to adopt the language of the French Revolution, which was raging across the Atlantic at the same time. They spoke of liberty, equality, and fraternity, of fighting against tyrants and aristocrats. They saw themselves as part of a global struggle for the rights of the common man. To Federalists like Washington and Hamilton, this rhetoric was absolutely terrifying. They watched the news of the bloody reign of terror in France with horror. The last thing they wanted was that kind of radical, violent, anti-authority fervor spreading to the American backcountry. This fear helps explain the sheer scale of their military response. They weren't just putting down a tax protest. They were trying to stamp out what they saw as a dangerous and infectious revolutionary ideology. But to the whiskey rebels, these words weren't dangerous. They were a promise. They were the same promises that had fueled the American Revolution a decade earlier. They felt that the elite class running the country had already broken that promise, and they were simply trying to reclaim the liberty they had already fought for once before. In this way, the rebellion served as an early and potent warning sign for the new nation. The deep divisions between rural and urban communities, and between the working poor and the wealthy elite, were not going to simply disappear. These tensions were baked into the fabric of America. The Whiskey Rebellion was just the first time they violently boiled over. George Washington's decision to personally lead troops into western Pennsylvania was one of the boldest and riskiest acts of his entire career. At the time, many Americans viewed the presidency as a somewhat distant, almost ceremonial office, a kind of executive moderator for a government that was still finding its footing. With this single march, Washington shattered that image forever. He demonstrated that the president was not a passive figurehead, but the active and ultimate enforcer of federal law. For Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion was a fundamental test of the constitutional system he had helped create. He had presided over the convention that drafted the Constitution, and he was now charged with making it work. If he failed, if he allowed a violent faction to intimidate the government and ignore legislation, the entire project could unravel. The 13 states, so recently united, could easily decide they were better off on their own. In that light, the rebellion wasn't just a backcountry riot. It was the canary in the coal mine of American democracy. Washington's personal involvement carried enormous symbolic weight. His reputation was nearly mythical in the young nation. He was the father of his country, the hero of the Revolution, a man revered by veterans and respected by almost all citizens. When word spread that Washington himself was riding west at the head of an army, it had a profound psychological impact. Many of the rebels simply couldn't fathom fighting against the man who, for them, personified American liberty. This gamble paid off spectacularly. Washington didn't need to fire a single shot to win the confrontation. His mere presence, backed by a massive army, was enough to restore order and reaffirm the power of the federal government. But just as important as his decision to march was his decision to stop. Once the rebellion had dissolved, he withdrew the army. He didn't impose a long-term military occupation. He didn't conduct mass punishments. And he didn't turn the affair into a show trial to humiliate his opponents. He had proven the government's strength, and then he immediately sheathed the sword. This act of restraint was crucial. He reminded everyone, firmly, that the law was not optional, but he did so without turning the presidency into a military dictatorship. It was a masterclass in political leadership, demonstrating power and magnanimity at the same time. Yet, not everyone applauded this move. Those in the Jeffersonian camp accused Washington of a massive overreaction. They painted the march as a dangerous flex of executive muscle that could have easily turned into a massacre. They argued that he had used the military to silence legitimate political dissent, setting a dangerous precedent for future presidents to use the army against their own people. Still, the swift and bloodless collapse of the rebellion allowed Washington to finish his presidency on a high note. He had faced the first major challenge to the nation's integrity and had navigated it with a careful balance of force and forgiveness. He had proven that the young republic could enforce its laws without becoming the tyrant it had fought to escape. Quietly, however, Washington understood that this would not be the last time America's unity would be tested, and that next time the outcome might not be so peaceful. Although the Whiskey Rebellion ended with barely a whimper, its echoes have rippled far and wide through the course of American history. In hindsight, this dusty, long-forgotten conflict over distilled grain was one of the most important constitutional and cultural stress tests the United States has ever faced. Its legacy is found in law, in politics, and even in the spirit itself. First and foremost, it set a critical legal precedent. The federal government now had undeniable proof that it possessed the right and the ability to enforce its laws anywhere in the nation, even in the face of violent opposition. Before this, the Constitution had been more of a theory than a reality. The Whiskey Rebellion and Washington's response demonstrated that the new government was not toothless like its predecessor under the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution had muscle, and it was willing to use it. However, with that demonstrated power came a lingering fear. For many Americans, especially in rural communities, the event solidified a deep-seated suspicion of the federal government. They began to see it not as a protector of their liberties, but as a distant, powerful entity controlled by Eastern elites who neither understood nor cared about their way of life. This anti-federal sentiment became a powerful and enduring force in American politics. Culturally, the Whiskey Rebellion became the stuff of legend in the Appalachian Hills. Stories were passed down through generations of brave distillers standing up to federal agents. These tales, sometimes romanticized and exaggerated, all carried the same core message: that government doesn't always have your back, and that true liberty sometimes requires a healthy dose of defiance. This spirit of rugged individualism and anti-authoritarianism became a celebrated part of American frontier identity. Back in the new capital city, lawmakers were taking careful notes. The Whiskey Rebellion became a crucial case study for future leaders on how to handle civil unrest. Was Washington's model a rapid, overwhelming show of force, followed by strategic mercy, the correct approach, or was it a dangerous example of executive overreach? This debate would be revisited time and again throughout American history. And what became of the whiskey tax itself? Ironically, despite the rebellion's failure, the tax was never a success. It was expensive to enforce. It was widely evaded by distillers, large and small, and it remained politically toxic. In the early 1800s, when Thomas Jefferson and his Republican Party came to power, one of their first acts was to repeal the hated tax. In a twisted way, the rebels had lost the battle, but ultimately won the war of public opinion. The frontier didn't forget the lessons of 1794, and neither did the government. The ghost of the rebellion would ride just behind future presidents as they faced their own challenges to federal authority. From the nullification crisis to the Civil War, it served as a constant reminder that order in the Republic is fragile, and that unity is never guaranteed. The rebellion may seem like a quirky footnote today, but its themes are surprisingly alive. Debates over federal power versus states' rights, tensions between rural and urban America, and fierce anti-tax movements all trace a faint line back to those angry farmers and their whiskey stills. It was a story that helped define the fundamental conflicts at the heart of the American experiment. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon had his famous legal code etched into a massive 8-foot-tall basalt stele. This towering monument was designed to assert divine justice and bring order to his kingdom. But buried within its 282 meticulously carved laws lies a story as ancient as civilization itself. The story of how society legally defined and controlled women. In Hammurabi's Babylon, a woman wasn't simply a person. She was a set of prescribed roles. She was a daughter, then a wife, then a mother, and perhaps, eventually, a widow. Each of these roles came with a precise legal definition, a clear social expectation, and if things went wrong, a swift and often brutal punishment. Her legal identity was almost entirely tied to the men in her life, her father, her husband, and her sons. Take, for example, the laws surrounding marriage. A woman was typically given in marriage by her father, an act that was legally a transfer of authority from one household to another. Once married, her fidelity was considered of paramount importance to the honor of her husband's family. If a woman was accused of adultery, the law was terrifyingly clear. Both she and her alleged lover could be bound together and thrown into the Euphrates River. However, the law contained a small but significant caveat. If the husband chose to spare his wife's life, the king would often pardon her lover as well. It was a strange sort of mercy, one that placed a woman's survival entirely in the hands of the man she had allegedly wronged. Meanwhile, if a man was unfaithful to his wife, Hammurabi's code was largely silent. Male infidelity was a private matter, not a crime that threatened the social order. The double standard was literally carved in stone. But not all the laws were purely oppressive. The code offered some surprising protections, especially for widows. A widow had the legal right to remain in her late husband's home and to use his property to raise their children until they came of age. If she had no sons, she could even inherit a portion of the property directly. In this way, the law recognized a woman's capacity for financial and administrative responsibility, but only within the strict confines of her family structure. Divorce was also legally possible. A woman could seek to leave her husband if he was cruel or neglectful, but the burden of proof was immense and dangerous. If she could not substantiate her claims, she could be branded a liar and, in some cases, be drowned as punishment. For a woman to seek justice was to risk everything. The dowry she brought into the marriage also afforded her a measure of financial security. This property, while managed by her husband, was legally hers and was meant to support her throughout her life. Returning to her or her original family in the case of divorce or her husband's death. Ultimately, the Code of Hammurabi shows us that women in ancient Babylon were far from invisible. They were named, categorized, judged, and at times protected. But they were always viewed through the lens of male authority and family honor. The law gave every woman a place, but it rarely gave her the power to choose it for herself. If we travel a few hundred miles west from Babylon and forward a few centuries in time, we arrive in ancient Egypt. Here, in the shadow of the pyramids, justice was personified not by a male king, but by Mat, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. Perhaps inspired by this divine feminine principle, the Egyptians developed a legal system that, on paper, offered women a surprisingly progressive set of rights, especially when compared to their Mesopotamian neighbors. From the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period, Egyptian law recognized women, regardless of their marital status, as distinct legal individuals. An Egyptian woman, whether she was rich or poor, had the legal right to own and manage her own property, to inherit land and wealth from her parents, and to dispose of her assets as she saw fit in her own will. This was a radical concept in a world where women were often considered property themselves. This autonomy wasn't just theoretical. It was practiced daily. Surviving legal documents on papyrus show women entering into contracts, suing and being sued in court, acting as witnesses in legal proceedings, and running their own businesses. A woman could lend money, buy and sell goods, and purchase land or slaves in her own name, without the need for a male guardian to approve the transaction. She was, in the eyes of the law, her own person. While high government offices were almost exclusively held by men, women were not entirely excluded from positions of influence. They could serve as priestesses, a role which carried significant ritual and sometimes economic power. There are even rare records of women serving in administrative roles, such as scribes or overseers, demonstrating that the barriers to entry, while high, were not absolute. However, there is an important distinction between legal rights and social reality. While the law granted women a great deal of freedom, Egyptian society was still largely patriarchal. Most women would have lived under the authority of their father and then their husband. While a woman could own a farm, it was often expected that she would pass it down to her male heirs. The law said you can, but social custom often whispered you shouldn't. Marriage in Egypt was viewed as a personal and legal agreement, not a sacred religious institution. Crucially, divorce was relatively straightforward and could be initiated by either the husband or the wife. Reasons for divorce were broad and could range from adultery to infertility, or even what we might today call incompatibility. Divorce carried little social stigma, and a divorced woman retained the rights to her own property and was free to remarry. Punishment under the law was also, in theory, remarkably equal. Men and women faced the same legal consequences for the same crimes. In practice, of course, class and connections often mattered more than gender. A noblewoman who committed a crime would likely face a far lighter punishment than a peasant man. The law was equal, but some people were always more equal than others. So, was ancient Egypt a feminist utopia? Not by modern standards. But in a world of rigid patriarchies that legally defined women as subordinate, Egypt stood as a remarkable exception. It offered women a degree of legal and economic agency that they would not see again in many parts of the world for thousands of years. In the land of the pharaohs, a woman was more than a role. She was a person with rights. In ancient India, the legal world of women was intricately woven with the philosophical concept of dharma, the moral, ethical, and social order that lies at the heart of Hindu thought. This framework, most famously codified in texts like the Manusmriti or the Laws of Manu, created a deeply hierarchical and duty-driven system. Within it, women were to be honored, protected, and respected, but only so long as they remained within the strict boundaries of their designated place. The Manusmriti, compiled sometime between 200 BCE and 200 CE, is a text full of contradictions when it comes to women. On one page, it famously declares, "Where women are honored, there the gods rejoice." Yet, on another, it warns that a woman must never be independent. The tone swings between divine reverence and domestic restriction, creating a legal and moral cage gilded with praise. At the core of this legal philosophy was the principle of lifelong male guardianship. A woman was legally bound to a male protector throughout her entire existence. In her childhood, she was under the authority of her father. During her marriage, she was under the authority of her husband. And in her widowhood, she was to be guided by her sons. Autonomy was not the ideal. Righteous obedience was. Marriage laws were central to a woman's dharma. Her primary duty was to marry, manage the household, serve her husband with unwavering fidelity, and, most importantly, bear sons to continue the family lineage. After the death of her husband, a widow's life was severely restricted. Remarriage was generally frowned upon and, in many communities, outright forbidden. This is the context in which the infamous practice of sati, where a widow was expected to immolate herself on her husband's funeral pyre, found moral validation in some legal and religious texts, though it was never a universally enforced command. That being said, the system was not entirely without nuance. Women of the upper castes, particularly in the Brahmin and Kshatriya classes, sometimes received an education in the scriptures and the arts. In the absence of male heirs, a daughter could, in some circumstances, inherit her father's property. Furthermore, in certain regions, particularly in southern India, older matrilineal traditions survived, granting women more significant property rights and social standing. Divorce was extremely rare and carried a heavy social stigma. Though certain legal grounds, like cruelty, abandonment, or impotence, were sometimes recognized. However, the husband always possessed far more legal freedom to dissolve a marriage than the wife. Punishments for social transgressions were also starkly unequal. A woman accused of adultery could be publicly shamed, disfigured, or cast out from her community. A high-status man who committed the same offense might only have to pay a small fine or perform a simple penance. A woman did possess a form of personal wealth known as stridin. This consisted of the gifts, jewelry, and clothing she received before and during her marriage, and it remained her personal property. While this offered a small sphere of economic agency, it was minor compared to the family property controlled by the men around her. In short, ancient Hindu law wrapped women in a complex web of veneration and limitation. They were considered sacred, the spiritual foundation of the family. But they were sacred in the way a temple statue is sacred, revered from a distance, essential to the order of things, but ultimately immobile and without the power to choose their own destiny. When we think of ancient Greece, our minds conjure images of democracy, groundbreaking philosophy, and epic drama, the very foundations of Western civilization. But for half of the population in city-states like classical Athens, the legal system was less about enlightened ideals and more about enforced invisibility. For Athenian women, the law was a cage that defined them not as citizens, but as permanent legal minors, bound for life to the guardianship of their nearest male relative. In the eyes of Athenian law, a woman had almost no independent legal identity. She could not vote, hold public office, or own any significant property in her own name. She was unable to enter into contracts for anything more than a trivial amount, and could not represent herself in a court of law. For her entire life, she was under the control of a kyrios, or guardian, first her father, then her husband, and if her husband died, her son or another male relative. Marriage was not a romantic partnership. It was fundamentally a property transaction. A woman's kyrios would arrange her marriage, essentially negotiating a transfer of assets. The woman, along with her dowry, was passed from her father's household to her husband's, a living, breathing component of an exchange designed to forge alliances and consolidate wealth between families. While she was legally powerless, her fidelity was of enormous legal importance. If an Athenian woman was caught committing adultery, the consequences were severe and immediate. Her husband was legally required to divorce her, and the man he caught her with could be legally killed on the spot by the husband, with no need for a trial. The state considered the violation of a man's home to be a grave offense. This stood in stark contrast to the freedoms afforded to her husband. An Athenian man could freely consort with courtesans, known as hetairai, or have relations with the household's slaves, without any legal or social penalty. This wasn't just a common practice. This profound double standard was woven into the very fabric of the legal and social structure. A man's honor was his own. A woman's honor belonged to her husband and family. If a woman was abused or abandoned by her husband, she had little recourse. She could not initiate a divorce herself. Her kyrios had to act on her behalf, bringing the case before the city's magistrates. Even in cases of the most serious crimes, such as assault or rape, a woman could not bring charges. Her male guardian had to be the one to pursue justice for her, as she was not considered a legal person capable of doing so. There was one famous exception to this rule: Sparta. Spartan women enjoyed a degree of freedom that would have shocked and scandalized the Athenians. They could own and inherit land, receive a formal education, and participate in athletic competitions. They were famously outspoken and confident, but Sparta was the anomaly, not the norm in the Hellenic world. In most of ancient Greece, and especially in Athens, the ideal woman was a silent one. Her virtue was measured by her obscurity. The great statesman Pericles summed up the prevailing attitude when he advised that the greatest glory for a woman was to be spoken of as little as possible among men, whether for praise or for blame. They were the silent shadows in a world that prized public speech and civic liberty, but only for its men. In the world of ancient Rome, the law was a powerful and pragmatic instrument designed to build and manage an empire. And like everything else the Romans did, their laws concerning women were deeply structured, hierarchical, and full of fascinating complexities. Roman women were by no means equal citizens, but compared to their nearly invisible Greek counterparts, they occupied a much more visible and legally significant space within society. From birth, a Roman woman was under the patria potestas, or the absolute authority of the head of her family, her father. When she married, this authority could either be transferred to her husband, in a form of marriage called in manu, or it could remain with her birth family, in a marriage sign, manu. Over time, this second form became increasingly common, and it had profound consequences for female autonomy. A sign manu marriage meant that a married woman remained legally part of her father's family. This allowed her to inherit from her father and, crucially, to own and manage her own property independently of her husband. This legal loophole opened the door for women, especially those from wealthy families, to accumulate vast personal fortunes, own estates, run businesses, and draft their own contracts. While they still couldn't vote or hold public office, they could become major economic players. The law recognized their ability to act in the legal sphere. Women could initiate lawsuits, often with a male sponsor acting on their behalf, and they could serve as guardians for their children. The Roman world was full of wealthy widows and powerful daughters who were legally active, managing their assets and wielding the influence that came with their wealth. Still, Roman law and society placed a heavy emphasis on proper female behavior. The ideal Roman woman was defined by pudictia, a virtue encompassing modesty, loyalty, and chastity. Adultery, which had once been a private family matter, was made a public crime for women under the moral reforms of Emperor Augustus. A woman found guilty could lose half her dowry, have her property confiscated, and be exiled to a remote island. Meanwhile, a man's infidelity, especially with slaves or non-citizens, remained legally unproven. A unique and powerful exception to the rule of male guardianship was the Vestal Virgins. These 6 priestesses, who tended the sacred flame of Vesta, were the only women in Rome legally free from the authority of their fathers or husbands. In exchange for a 30-year vow of chastity, they were granted immense public prestige, legal independence, and even the power to pardon condemned prisoners. However, if a Vestal broke her sacred vow, the punishment was terrifying. She was buried alive. Beyond the formal law, respected married women of the upper classes, the Roman matrons, held significant social power. They were the managers of vast households, the arrangers of political marriages, and the influencers of powerful sons and husbands. The legal system acknowledged their status through various protections for their dowries and a form of male guardianship called tutela, which, by the imperial period, was often just a legal formality that a woman could navigate around. In essence, the Roman legal system placed women within a cage, but it was a cage with bars, spaced just far enough apart to allow for a surprising degree of movement. For women born into wealth and a powerful family, this legal framework offered them the tools to exercise agency, accumulate wealth, and wield influence from behind the scenes. They were constrained by law and tradition, yes, but they were never entirely silenced. In ancient Hebrew society, law was a divine instruction from the Torah. This framework placed women at the moral heart of the family, but under male authority. The ketubah, a marriage contract, offered women unique financial security. Yet they could not initiate divorce directly, and laws on fidelity remained unequal. In the vast Persian Empire, a more pragmatic legal system allowed elite women, especially royalty, to act as powerful landowners and administrators, showcasing a surprising degree of autonomy. Further east, ancient Chinese law was shaped by Confucian ideals of social harmony. The philosophy of the three obediences, to father, then husband, then son, was reflected in a legal system where women were subordinate in nearly all contexts. They were excluded from public office and inheritance, and while vital to the family, they were not seen as independent legal persons. As we look across this ancient world, a clear theme emerges. A woman's legal identity was almost always relational, defined by the men around her. Some civilizations, like Egypt, offered remarkable legal agency, allowing women to own property and act for themselves. Others, like Athens, built democracies for men while rendering women legally invisible. Rome created a more complex system of control and opportunity, while India wrapped its women in a paradoxical embrace of reverence and restriction. In all these societies, women navigated the laws, finding spaces for influence and power, shaping their worlds from within the structures that sought to define them. Long before Wall Street or modern finance, the concept of banking began in the mud-brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia. The world's first bankers were not financiers, they were priests. Temples were the most trusted institutions, and farmers would deposit their grain harvests in the temple granaries for safekeeping. In return, they received a clay tablet inscribed with the details of their deposit. This tablet was more than a receipt. It was an early form of a check which could be traded to pay debts or buy goods. These temples also acted as lenders, issuing loans of grain or silver at high interest rates, with default leading to the loss of land or even freedom through debt slavery. Over time, a class of private money lenders emerged in cities like Babylon. They offered more flexible loans to merchants and craftsmen, using weighed silver instead of coins. These transactions were recorded on detailed clay contracts that specified interest rates and collateral, which could include land, goods, or even family members. This system of trust, record-keeping, and lending, with its contracts and consequences, laid the essential groundwork for the entire global financial system we know today. We've traveled from the muddy trenches of World War II to the dusty marketplaces of the ancient world tonight. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the quieter halls of history here on Medieval Nocturnes. If you enjoyed our exploration and would like to support the channel, please take a moment to subscribe. We'll be back soon with another story. Until then, sleep well.